We're now on the top of Daf Chaf Amid Beis. Ki Hadar of Ashi Havi Yedile B'Sadusa L'Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi had edus in something that would be relevant to Rav Kahana. But as the years went by, he forgot the edus. Rav Kahana needed that edus. Amalei turns to Rav Ashi, says, Mi Dokir Mar Hai Sadusa. Do you remember so-and-so, this and this, that's what happened and you were witnessing, you were a witness? Amalei, Rav Ashi said, Lo, I don't understand. I don't remember it. So Rav Kahana comes back and he asks Rav Ashi a second time. The Lav Hachi V'Hachi Hav, he starts giving him some details of the Masechet Shahaya. Amalei, Lo Yadan, I still don't really remember it. But Lebesof, after a certain period of time went by, Aidkar Rav Ashi, he remembered it. Biasidle, and he testified on behalf of Rav Kahana. So Chazil Rav Kahana Dahavi Mechasem. Rav Kahana was a little bit inhibited about the whole thing. He didn't feel comfortable about it. And he said, well, why would you testify when I myself was the one who reminded you of the edus, and you yourself didn't remember the edus? Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, Mi Savas Allah Kasampa, I know the Ramoy Nafshe V'Yidkirei. You think that I was relying on this edus because I relied on what you told me? That's not so. I took it upon myself to remember the edus, and I remember the edus with all its details after you mentioned it to me, after you reminded me. So we see that in the case of a Talmud Chacham, he could testify because he knows himself well enough to know that he remembers the edus. Tanan Hassam, we have a Mishnah in Masechet Olos. Let's give a little bit of an introduction here. We have a mess which is called Avia Vosatuma. It's Matami Odom Kelim. And it doesn't necessarily mean Bimaga. It could even mean that the OL, they were in the same OL, or a Hilu of, or the mess went on top of him. And a person who becomes Tameh, he contracts Tumas mess, is Tameh Shivas Yomim. And he's not allowed to eat Taros and Kodshim until he's Matar himself with Azah and Shlishi V'Shvi of Mechatas, and then does Tefillah. And therefore, people should be very careful about where they bury the dead. They shouldn't bury the dead on what's called the Yema Derech, out there on the crossroads. They should find a private spot. So they don't want to bring Tumah, especially Kohanim. So Hatlulios, these are little little piles of afar that are gathered together on the sides of the roads. And people usually go to those little mini hills, little man-made mountains, and they bury their dead. And we're not afraid that somebody's going to pass by there and contract tumor, because people don't go over to these higher places to climb over them. They're kind of tall. Hakrovos bein ir le'ir bein derech l'derech. If these piles are close to each other, or close to the city or the highway, so it means that people are there around people are there around the tefillios. Is echad chadoshos v'echad yishanos, whether or not these tziburim, these tefillios were set up recently or who knows when, long ago. If a person would climb over them, he would be ma'el al mess, because we're assuming that over the course of time, maybe even many, many years ago, they buried the dead over there. And people don't remember that. Now, if it's a Tlulios Chadoshos situation, then we should be able to retire the person who went on a tluyis chadasha, because if somebody buried the dead there, we would certainly know about it. It would be public knowledge, and we don't know about anybody who buried the dead in those piles. But nevertheless, since they're located one near the other, one pile next to the other, they're tmeos. We're afraid that maybe a woman buried a nefel in one of those fluios, one of those tails, and she didn't tell anyone, not even her own husband. However, rechokos, till now we were talking about krovos to the irok, to the derech. Now we're talking about rechokos. They're far away from the city or from the roads. Women don't go there to bury a nefel. So here we're going to differentiate between chadashos and yeshanos. Chadashos, tahoros. We're not going to assume that anyone would have buried the dead, because if they had done so, then it would be public knowledge. We would know about this kavura. And therefore, we're not choshesh that some woman went out there on her own and buried a nefel. Rachel. So we have a cheskes tar. Yeshanos, tmeos. Now we're going to assume that some lady buried the dead over there and it was forgotten. It was so long ago, so much time has elapsed, it was forgotten. Ezo hi krova. What's considered that it's close enough to the city or to the highway? Chamishim amma. The ezi yeshana. When is it considered that such a long period of time has passed that we might have forgotten about the fact that there were dead bodies buried there? Is shishim shana divrei Rabbi Meir. It's already been 60 years since those tulios were created. Rabbi Yehuda Omer krova she'ein krova himena. What is considered a tulius krova? It's the krova biyoser la'ir. That's called a krova. So what does that mean? A woman who would want to stealthily, bury the nefel, she would go to the nearest tail, which is closest to the city. So if you want to be choshesh for such a thing, that there's a tumas nefel in one of these tlulios, and isolate the tlulis that's closest to the city. That's the first one she'll encounter when she leaves the city, and that's where she'll bury the dead. Yeshana. If on the other hand, Sean, can you close your door? If on the other hand, it's a tail that's a little bit distant and there's a closer tail, so it's a little bit further away from the city, then Yeshana she'ein adam zochra. I'm sorry. So again, the two things that Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Let's differentiate. First of all, he's telling you what's considered a krova. Krova means ein krova yosem imenu. Then he's going to tell you what is considered a yeshana. She'ein adam zochra. Nobody can remember, hey, when was the groundbreaking day that we dug this tail or piled up this tail? Now the Gemara clarifies, my ear, umay derech. Ilema ear mamish. We're talking about an ear stam. It's not anywhere near a cemetery. Or derech mamish. Any highway, even it doesn't pass through any Beis HaKvaros, is then I don't understand. We don't know that they buried the dead in that tail. It's a suffix. So why should the Rabbanan be machzik these tlulios, which are krovos or yichanos, with a cheskas tuma? V'amrei shlokish, Masechet Nazir, Samachem is beid. Ila mitzmatu betiaru be'eretz Yisrael. So in other words, even if there's a reason, a logical reason why we should be choshesh that there's tumah there, but the Rabbanan were pushing for Taras Eretz Yisrael. So the Kohanim could be Oskim V'Taros and go down that path. So why would the Chacham be machmir to be metami tlulios because of a chashash tumah? Since they were always trying to find a reasoning to allow the Kohanim to be Osik B'Taros and the people to come to Eretz Yisrael B'Tara, they weren't machmir. So why would they be machmir to be metami tlulios? Rather, says the Gemara Rav Zera, ear. What does an ear mean? Ear asmucha beis hakvaros and derech beis hakvaros. When do we say that the tail that's close to a city has a cheskas that they were cover the mason there? That's only in a case where we're talking about smucha beis hakvaros. So if it's right outside the city, and that's where the Beis HaKvaros is, then we have to be careful because we have to assume that maybe they came there to bury the dead. So the Gemara asks, Bishlema, Derech Beis HaKvaros. I understand that if there's a derech that'll take you all the way to the city that has a Beis HaKvaros, is zimnin de misrami ben hashmachos umikru kavru betel. Perhaps what happened was it was erev chas ben hashmachos, and it was a city that doesn't have a Beis HaKvaros. They don't have the time to carry the dead and bury the dead. Like Gia ad Beis HaKvaros, it's Erev Shabbos, and therefore they took advantage of the opportunity to bury the dead in the tail. Ella ira smuchel Beis HaKvaros. Okay, so there's a tail that's nearby the city. Kulu Beis HaKvaros Azli. To the entire, all the members of the city, they go to the Beis HaKvaros, which is nearby, and they bury their dead there. Why are you choshesh that they would bury the dead in Tlulios Hasmuchas Leir? There's a Beis HaKvaros all year. Everybody knows that we take the dead and we bury it in the Beis HaKvaros. So l'chor, there's no reason to assume that people buried their mason in the tail when there's a Beis HaKvaros right near the city. Or Rav Chanina, even in the case of a city that has a Beis HaKvaros right outside the city, we're still choshesh. Maybe the burial of the dead took place in the Tlulios. Nitoshan Noshim, Kovrel Shom Nifleim, Umuki Shchinz Roseyan. Period. So these are situations in which people will not go all the way out to the Beis HaKvaros and bury it there. A woman who's embarrassed about having a miscarriage or a stillborn, and she buries the nefel inside the tail, where Mukashchin buries his rose. Zroa here is an Ever Shenichtach Min HaChai. It's Mitame Kmo Ever Min HaMes. Biad Chamichim Amo, if it's only a distance of 50 Amo outside the city or outside of the Derech, is Azla'i, the woman who had this Hapola, she goes Lechuda, she's not afraid to go alone to bury the Nefel. She'll take that chance. But Tfei, if it's more than 50 Amo outside the city, is Davra Inshi Bada. She'll definitely bring along with her somebody else, because she's afraid to go too far out of the city, more than 50 am out of the city. Be exposing her to a great danger. Well, the Beis HaKfaras Oslo. And if she has someone else who's accompanying her, because it's more than 50 am and she's afraid to go herself, then that they will, at the end of the day, they'll bury inside the Beis HaKfaras. There's no reason to bury outside the Beis HaKfaras. Hilchach Tuma B'Eretz Yisrael lo machzikinon. Lo chziku chachomes hatluyos harachokos b'chezkas Tuma. We're not afraid that the women are going to go all that far out of the city in order to bury the nef. Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, Ezo hi yishana, shishim shana. So there was 60 years that passed since they piled up this tzibur of this tail, this tulios. And after such a long period of time has passed, says Rabbi Meir, people don't remember that there were dead bodies that were buried there. 60 years went by already. So we see that the shear of Shichacha is 60 years. High Sadusa, therefore any Edus, Ad Shitim Shnin Midkar, Tvei Lo Midkar. Up to 60 years of a limit, it's possible to remember the details of your Edus. But after 60 years have gone by, then it's natural for people to forget, and therefore they cannot testify. You can't testify about something that you forgot. And after 60 years, there's no doubt that you forgot. The Gemara rejects this. Rav Chisda does not accept it. The case of somebody who buried the dead in a tluyus is not comparable, it's not analogous to another edus that they testified in a bezdin. Hasamu delo ram yaleh, in the case of Kfuras Mes, that's not something that's on his mind. He doesn't feel responsible to testify about it. And after 60 years, he certainly forgets. Aval hacha, but in edus, he was designated, he was appointed to testify. He's came into Rami Alei, Afilu Tuvanami, even after 60 years, he will still remember his edus. And the diuk is that Rashi's holding, if he wasn't appointed as an aide, he doesn't feel responsible. He's like the guy who happens to know that they buried the dead in the tail. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Chaf Amid Beis, which in Mirza Hashem we'll pick up tomorrow. Okay, so let me wish you a great day.